Here's our agenda. We're going to talk about development. We got the ESU 9 racehorse out for this one. And so just really excited to have him or have our racehorse run us through today's events. So we're going to talk about development. We're going to talk about kind of what typical development will look like, some impacts on development that could happen. You know, when we think that we have a problem, kind of an overview of some different programming that occurs in the schools, and then a little bit of IEP history. Now, I think that we have lots more that we can kind of talk about. And so this could be just a little bit of a segment that I would be continuing on as we kind of get the overview done. So that'll be something to talk about in the future. So when we're looking at typical development, really what we're looking at is like when a child is born, you know, are these things in place? So is there, you know, do they have good vision? You know, do they have, is their speech developing kind of typically? The nose is kind of like, is there any sensory things that are going on that kind of overpower that student and you know, stop them or delay them in learning? And so we see the kind of the little thumbs. And so there's two different areas that we really look at carefully. So one area is the fine muscle motor movements, you know, things like, you know, how does a student hold their pencil? You know, are they able to color within the lines at a certain time? And there's different milestones that we have as we kind of go through these things. Hearing is always super important. So if we have a hearing loss, that's something that we know that's going to impact how they're going to be able to learn. And then the kind of the muscle piece is kind of that gross motor muscle coordination. So those are things like, can the, you know, specifically what physical therapists look for, things like, you know, how are they able to coordinate their movements? You know, are they able to hop? Are they able to skip? Are they able to kind of do gallop? Are they able to do these different kinds of big muscle motor movements? Can they catch a ball? Can they catch a small ball? And so those are the things that a physical therapist really looks at to see, you know, kind of what's there. And kind of the knee and the foot are really kind of indicative of, again, just kind of growth and development. You know, if a student is, you know, are they able to walk at a certain age? You know, are they growing to the right height? And of course, those are really what, you know, those wellness checks are super important as the parents kind of go through that whole process with their doctors. Now, developmentally, what we really look at very much for the schools is there's just kind of, they're all parts of a whole. So we like to take and we like to break it down into, oh, you know, our speech therapist looks at just the general speech and language of that student, or the OT just looks at the fine motor movements. But the truth of the matter is it's all broken down into the parts of a whole. So are the students' cognitive skills at a typical level? You know, are they able to communicate? Are they able to understand what's going on around them? Are they able to express their thoughts in a manner that's, you know, age appropriate? Are they social and emotional? You know, did they have some understanding on how to work with other students or how to work with other kids or peer groups and to kind of understand, you know, like having that emotional maturity to be able to just play with other kids. And then the last one is just, you know, their physical skills. And so are they developing, you know, physically in the way that we would say that would be typical of other children that age? So when we look at development, that's really kind of the whole, the parts of the whole that we really look at. So, hey, we're moving along in our ESU 9 racehorse of glory. And we've gone from kind of looking at those development areas and typical development. And again, I'll have Cesar share this slide deck, but the CDC has some really nice resources there that talk about, you know, what would we look at for typical development. I shared a lot of that with the group last week, but I'll have Cesar send this link out to everybody here. But that gives you kind of a good baseline to, let's see if we can kind of click on that and see where it takes us. So it gives us a nice baseline on developmental milestones. It's also in Spanish. I couldn't find the place where I think some of the different checklists are in different languages too. So you'll just have to play around on the site and see kind of what it does. it gives you kind of a nice set of free materials that you can hand out to your parents. So this is kind of a nice resource for kind of the group, so that when you're talking with parents, this is a good way to kind of say, are we meeting the milestones that are typical for that child? Now, with that in mind, sometimes kids will, well, I mean, there's some gender pieces that are part of this. So girls develop language quicker than boys do, and speech skills quicker than boys do. That's just a fact. Girls are also mature. They have the social emotional skills that are more intact than boys do as they develop through. So sometimes we'll see in interacting with maybe your own kids, you'll see, you might see like some really good language skills that develop, or some really good physical skills. Suddenly they can catch a ball. Suddenly they can easily walk up and down stairs that wasn't there before. And so those are the things that we kind of have to compare to one another as we kind of move forward in, what is typical or what's outside of typical. So this kind of gives us a little bit more of an understanding of really what that looks like. There's a little QR code. So if you hand this out to parents, then they can use that QR code. Cognitive development, super important when we start looking at cognitive development. And, is this student developing, again, with typically of their peers? I encourage you to look at the hand. We won't do it today, but I want you to look at the hand model, because, essentially one of the big pieces that was part of my learning is that when you put the brain, your brain kind of looks like your hands. In this model, your brain kind of looks like this, because when your eyes actually cross over, and the part of your brain that you see with is in the back of your head. So it crosses through your brain, and your right side of your brain actually controls the left side of your body. So it's kind of some interesting cognitive development that's part of that process. That model kind of gives you a good idea, but you can actually track where learning occurs in the brain. And so, for example, we see oftentimes with students that might have a specific, let's say that they're a fetal alcohol syndrome student. Well, they're going to have some impacts in their frontal lobe. Well, your frontal lobe controls impulsivity, it controls attention, it controls a lot of different things. And so we know if there's been some, if we've had some impacts on the brain, we know that's going to affect how that student is able to learn. One of the most interesting pieces that I've always found fascinating is that we actually don't see with our eyes. We see really with our brain. Our eyes are just kind of a vessel that takes in the light and it takes in things around us. Our brain gives it meaning. And that's the same with hearing. We can hear different languages, but it's our brain that actually gives that the meaning that it needs to have. And so it really, if there's any kind of impacts that we've seen with students, then it really is kind of a brain issue at the end of the day. All right, we're moving along. The racehorse is just moving through our program. One of the big issues, and I kind of talked about that just a little bit earlier, is, what is the impacts or the likely impacts on a child's development that would really interfere or have a negative impact on their education. And so when we start looking at that, we can start saying, is there anything that happened that involved the brain? So was there a stroke that occurred, prenatally? Was the individual, did they have a traumatic birth? So those are questions that, as providers, that you can definitely talk to families about, and to see, if there was a traumatic birth, then we know that that there might be some impacts on how they're able to learn later on. Is there a syndrome that's part of that student's medical history? Because that might very well have an impact on, like, so for example, Down syndrome. has a certain set of characteristics that are, part of that student's ability. So they, typically a Down syndrome student or a student with Down syndrome would have a more of a, they are able to understand information more than they express it, and typically they have heart issues that go along with that syndrome. So those are things just to understand, because there's kind of there's a variability in how severe those characteristics are. But if we know that that student has that, then it kind of is typical of some different characteristics that they might have on in later life. If there's been a major medical issue that student's been diagnosed with, that will have an impact on their development. Their environment will have a giant impact on their development. And of course, what we do is that we work with the students that have moved quite a bit. And we know that might have an impact on their continuation of their skills and their abilities. And if they haven't had exposure to different resources and materials, such as books in the home, that might have an impact. We know that we're seeing lots of impacts on students right now, especially at the younger ages, because because of COVID, then they didn't go to grocery stores, and they didn't go to, typical movie theaters and typical things that a child would do growing up. And we're seeing some issues with just exposure that are coming out of that. And of course, like I mentioned before, moving. When you move from one place to the other, that's the whole reason the program exists. And sometimes there's just a lack of resources. There might be a lack of food. There might, you might have food instability or transportation instability as part of that, and there might be some kind of maybe trauma that comes out of that whole piece too. So those are some things that we have to think about that we're going to have an impact. Second language acquisition. So there's kind of it's like a catch-22, or there's kind of so for example, if a student is learning two different languages, so I'm teaching my daughter sign language as she develops. Then when I start doing that, and if I do it, like if I'm just talking to her in sign language, and that's the language, it's partially the language that we're using at home, she's going to be, she's going to be learning that, and it's going to delay her, English. So she's going to be communicating, in sign language more than she might be communicating in English, but she'll be kind of learning those two languages at the same time, which means that there might be a little bit of delay at the earlier years, but she's going to have a naturalistic signing ability that I don't have as a second, because I learned sign language later in life. That she'll have that fluidity because her brain is developing around that language, and so she'll be very bilingual at that point. And I think that that's something that we have to really keep in mind, is that student might not have really solid ability. It just takes longer to get real solid expressive, or what you're able to talk about and what you're able to understand abilities takes a little longer when you're learning two at the same time. And so that's something that we just have to understand as we're kind of moving forward. Hearing loss is something that can have a giant impact on a student's ability to learn, especially if they're not, it just makes sense, not able to bring in that information. How are they able to understand it? One of the things that happens often and that we see is that students will have ear infections. Well, that ear infection will cause a hearing loss, and that hearing loss might be, something that's kind of transitional. So we give them some antibiotics, and the ear infection goes away, and then suddenly it comes back, and then so like you have this kind of series of ear infections that this student might have, and at that point, then it really affects really how they're able to understand and take in language, because that hearing loss has happened for such a long time, even though it's kind of intermittent. So that's something to also consider when you're talking with families, is that, has that student had a ear infection over and over again, because that can affect their speech, and it can affect how they're able to understand kind of the language around them. Trauma has a big impact on development. And so like if that child was in an abusive family or neglectful family, then that's going to impact them later on in life. And you're going to see, a lot more behaviors and a lot more gaps in their learning because of that. And, vision. I think that that's a big piece, is that if they're not able to see, it just kind of makes sense. They're not able to see, words, then they're not going to be able to understand that those words have sound associated when the words have meaning, because they're not seeing it the way that we want them to. Now, our brain, as we talk about brain development, our brain does a magical thing to all of us, is that it tries to stabilize how we think. So it tries to normalize our thinking. And so when we're looking at like ourselves, every one of us that are on this call today have hearing loss of some kind. And that as you get older, your hearing loss increases, but your brain does not, but your brain still normalizes that. And so you don't really sometimes, it's kind of like when you have glasses like myself, and suddenly you put in your glasses, you're like, whoa, I didn't realize how unclear that was. Well, that's because your brain tries to normalize what goes on. And so that's the same thing that happens with our students, is they, this is the way they see the world. They don't realize that they might not be, their vision is interrupting things or not. So that's just something to keep in mind as we kind of go through this whole process. All right, so we're moving along again. So we're looking at kind of what are some different impacts that could happen. Do we have any questions about that right now? All right. So what do we do if we have a problem? So now we kind of have to step back and kind of look at the bigger picture of what do we do when we think we have a problem? So in kind of in the school world, we have different programs that we're looking at. Now we have an IEP, which comes out of a law that was put in place back in 1992. That's the latest update that's been part of that law. It's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, so IDEA. And that's what drives all IEPs in our school, is that law. We also have a law called Section 504. And both of these come out of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so to kind of put a brief overview on all of these different pieces. So if we want to refer a student to any one of these, so it would be under the Americans with Disabilities Act, so an ADA piece. So in schools, it's either a IEP or an IDEA piece or a Section 504. And we'll talk about that a little briefly. There's some differences between those two programs. And so, but as far as schools look, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that that if that child has a disability, or what we clarify or classify as a disability, then they're able to connect with the curriculum that goes on in the classroom. So we're trying to keep, it's kind of like if you think about, I'm in the Hastings Public Library. It has an elevator and it has, doors that open with a push button. And that's because it then allows people wheelchair access to this building. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to have access to the building. And so in a school setting, what's going on there is to have access to that curriculum. And so we need to make sure that that occurs. And so when we're looking at the student's disability, we say, well, this is how their disability or their special circumstance impacts how they're able to learn in the school environment. So these are the programs that are available to make that happen. And they're both laws under ADA. And it really looks at how to give equal access to those students in the classroom. Any questions about that so far? Okay. All right. we've figured out the different programs, and now I'm going to talk about IEPs and kind of a little bit of history of IEPs. So here is a logic train. And so IEPs are a law. And so there's the law factor that goes into all of that kind of component. And so when we look at that series of that law, what are the school's requirements for making sure that this happens? And so I like to think about it as a logic train. So you have to have each part of the car in this train for it to move forward. And if we have one of the cars missing, then the school is not doing the requirements that they need to have for that student. And so when we say, to kind of loop back around and say, okay, well, we have a student, and our student has a specialized need. Let's say that they have a hearing loss, and we say, well, okay, well, we've already seen the impacts. And when we look at that list of impacts, hearing loss is on that list. Okay, so now we know that's a need, right? And so the first kind of the leader of our logic train is the child find piece. So we have to make sure that the school has an obligation to make sure that they're finding all the students in their district that has some kind of a special need. And then they have to have that there has to be a process there, so that gets referred. You guys can be part of that referral process, or you can help the parents become part of that referral process too. And so if there is a suspected need, then it's the obligation of the school district to kind of figure out what is that need and how do we evaluate that to see what kind of educational impact that's going to have. Because again, we have to make sure that that student is connected to that classroom curriculum. So there's, sometimes you'll see signs for child find, and you'll see, all kinds of things, but essentially it's a process for us to refer students onto the schools. And so even if, so for example, if you're in a home visit and the parents say, I'm super concerned. I'm concerned about their abilities to do, follow basic directions. And they're, I've talked to the teacher. The teacher is also a little bit concerned about this. And I would like to make a referral. And so the process is just really simply that the parents, it kind of helps because you can make a referral and, like go up to the principal and say, hey, I'm concerned. I would like to make a referral. It's always better to send an email so that that referral, we know where it goes and we can follow up with that so it doesn't get lost. So that's how I would recommend that if you have a student that's and this could be a student that's, so let me jump back just a little bit. So a school district's obligation is to serve all the students in their districts from birth to 21. And so that's why we serve OSY, and that's why we serve, that's kind of, that's kind of the whole process there. And so as we go through this, then even if they're a 1-year-old, there's still a system there. So if you contact their school administration, then there's a process there that other professionals will get involved with that whole child find piece. Any questions about that? Then there is a referral, and the referral in this process, again, so once we've moved into this whole piece, it becomes a very formal process. And as we move into the formality of all of this, then it becomes a little bit more complex because we want to make sure that the school now has an obligation to make sure that they have figured out the needs of the student and looking at that impact on education. So then after the referral is made, then there's a very formal process that you go through for evaluation. And then there's professionals that will help in that whole process. So for example, then you might have a school psychologist that does the cognitive testing, a speech language pathologist that does the speech and language evaluation, a physical therapist that does the gross motor, and an occupational therapist that does the fine motor. If there's a specialty, so for example, the student has needs for vision, then that vision teacher is then looped into that conversation to make sure that there is a full evaluation that's done so that we can really pinpoint what the student's needs are. That process is called a multidisciplinary team meeting, or an MDT, and that's the beginning of the setup for eligibility. The second CAR is eligibility. And so as we look at eligibility, it's really simply, there is a criteria that the state of Nebraska has of whether this is a disability or not a disability. And so as far as IEPs go, then that eligibility becomes really super important. So the student is either eligible or they're not eligible according to Rule 51 or 52 that the state of Nebraska sets up. Now, that doesn't mean the student won't get any services, but they won't get any services through an IEP. The last one is you develop the IEP. So you go from your MDT, your multidisciplinary team meeting, to an individualized education program. So the individualization is super important when we're talking about IEP development. Now, there'll be a team. Like I said, there's a team of professionals. And the idea is that as you go through this very formalized process now, the parents have a right to voice what their feelings are as part of that team. So the parents are they're a big factor in any of those team meetings. The team meetings meet once a year. So it's an annual team meeting where they go through the different assessments that have occurred, and they try to pinpoint, what is the continuous impact of the student's disability in the school. Then the team members can go through and they develop goals for that student for the whole upcoming year, and where the services are going to take place and how long the services are going to be. So it's basically who, what, where, why, when of the actual individualized program that student's in. And that's kind of the meeting. And again, I'm just doing a brief overview. I'd love to come back and talk about more specifics as we kind of move through this. And then we implement the IEP. So you can kind of see that process there is that we find the students, we evaluate them, we place them, and then we serve them. And so that's really the kind of the whole simplistic piece of what an IEP does. We've gone through our history so far. And so that's all I have for us to do today. Love to have some questions and comments and what we need to do in the future.
I did want to have, well, thank you, Joe, thank you. But I did want to have, Amy had a comment that she wanted to bring up. Amy?
Hi, yes. Are Seth's already talking about what I had mentioned yesterday?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to, I guess I mentioned to Sessa that, as we change staff often or whatever, that when students are on IEPs or IFSPs, migrant comes after that. The SPED services do a lot of services themselves. So I was just stating to Sessa to make sure that we don't step before the SPED services come in, that we are above and beyond all the other services that they get. We're there to support anything after what SPED does. So it's important for us as migrant staff to also know what services are being provided so that we don't step on toes or we don't start supplanting, I guess would probably be the right word, for services that students are already supposed to be getting from their school districts and their SPED services.
I think that's a great point. And I think that as we, the main person to contact would be the case manager. So each one of each IEP that's out there will have a case manager that really has a lot more information. Now there might be some, some special pieces that we need to be put in place, and the parents need to be involved in, in your conversations with the school, just for, for confidentiality kind of pieces. But you're completely right. What I would do if I found out that the student was on an IFSP or an IEP is I would contact that case manager, with the parents understanding that I'm doing that, and try to really look at, what are the services that we could help supplement. Why I kind of would like to continue with our series is that I feel like IEPs are both part of what a school's obligation to, but this is a federal program, just like, migrant is a federal program. So with any federal program, then there's a set of very strict guidelines that go with this. And there's a very strict guidelines that and parent rights that they have in this process too. And so it's good that we're aware of those guidelines as service, so that, when these situations come up, you can, who do I need to contact to figure out what's going on? How can we help supplement what's happening there? And, what's our obligation versus the district, and how can we work together to really support this family? I feel like the real major role of any service provider is to help to provide that bridge between the family and that school. And so it's really important that you know kind of all the details here as you kind of move forward. Any other big questions?
This is all really awesome information, Joe. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, so what if the family is hesitant? So what if their child is showing signs that they might need an evaluation or an IEP, but the family is hesitant? Do you have any ways to help the families warm up to this whole process?
Well, I think that it's one of the things that's really kind of important in this process is that you're dealing directly with that school, and so there really isn't any kind of outside agencies. Like for example, if the family is not documented, then it really doesn't matter. IEPs are really beyond that whole piece. It really is just how they're connecting with the curriculum at their school, and so what I would have conversations with is I would have, is this typical of what we would typically see with that student? And if it's not, then that's concerning, because we don't want an educational impact on that student. And so that's, at the end of the day, that's what an IEP is set up for, is that making sure that we intervene early enough so that, so for example, if we're able to get some good, strong language foundations for that student, then that will equal having them read better. So they'll be able to understand what they'll be able to have, kind of everything really is based on how well their understanding of language is, and then how they're able to be fluid and fluent in that language. So when you take your first language, let's say that our students have two languages that they're learning, or maybe Spanish is their first language, or the list, it goes on and on. But we have to then, that's why EL services are so important, because we have to take that into account, is that we have to have that solid language foundation before we're able to build on anything else. And so those are the conversations that you can say, I understand that you're hesitant, but this might be something that, because the way our school system works is that you have, if you have not learned how to read by third grade, you're really in trouble, because at third grade you go from learning to read to learning from reading. And so if you haven't made that transition for reading, then you're really going to get farther and farther and farther behind. And so those are some things that when I talk to parents, that I say, I know that you're not seeing this now, but how our school system works is that I mean, you really have to have you have to be ready to start school. And if you're starting school with another language kind of as that major foundation, then you're going to need some help as you go through this process. That was a long method. It was a long way for me to answer that question, but did that make any sense?
It did, yes, and that was actually really helpful. Thank you.